The midsummer sun hung low over the sprawling estate of Thornfield Manor, casting elongated shadows across meticulously clipped hedges and fountains that whispered their own delicate secrets. The air was redolent with a mingling scents of roses, honeysuckle, and freshly cut grass. Yet beneath this floral veneer stirred the subtle tensions of a household perpetually balanced on the precarious ledge of society and survival. Here, within the ornate lattice of garden paths and marble statuary, the gentlewoman Eleanor Marchmont, barely 19, moved with an elegance honed through years of careful instruction, though her presence was often overlooked in the constellation of social brilliance that orbited her elder sister, Arabella. Arabella, with her golden hair perfectly coiled, eyes sparkling with ambition, and every movement polished for the scrutiny of guests, was the very embodiment of what society demanded: beauty, grace, and the ability to charm without effort. Eleanor, by contrast, carried herself with a quiet poise that betrayed her intelligence and inner resolve, yet her modest demeanor and bookish inclinations rendered her nearly invisible in the gleaming eyes of visiting nobility. The Marchmont family faced a subtle but insidious crisis, one invisible to casual observers, yet as present as the evening dew upon the garden blooms. Their estate, though proud in history, was burdened with debts that crept like silent shadows along the ledgers of household accounts. Their father, a gentleman of upright principles and inherited dignity, wore the lines of worry as prominently as the collars of his tailored coats. Arabella had been meticulously prepared for a marriage that could restore the family fortunes, and the murmurs among acquaintances suggested that a suitable alliance had been tentatively identified: a duke of ancient lineage, whose wealth was secure only by the careful stewardship of his dwindling heirs. Yet the family's youngest daughter, Eleanor, had been largely left in the periphery, her quiet mind and steady temperament considered virtues useful only for domestic diligence, or perhaps for the solace of her own studies. The garden party, orchestrated with the precision of a military campaign, was intended to display the family's adherence to refinement and to entice the eyes of those who might weigh the Marchmont fortunes against their social desirability. Guests, attired in the crisp elegance of Regency fashion, promenade beneath parasols of embroidered silk, their whispered conversations punctuated by polite laughter and the occasional clink of porcelain teacups. Arabella floated among them like a golden swan, greeting each with a practiced mixture of warmth and poise, while Eleanor lingered along the periphery, her hands folded gracefully before her, her gaze lowered in deference to the bustling social currents. It was then, in the dappled light that danced through the leaves of the ancient oaks, that the household's latent tensions erupted in a single, devastating instant. The stepmother, a woman of sharp wit but thinly veiled cruelty, whose ambitions were masked behind the courteous veneer of polite society, approached Eleanor with a smile that did not reach her eyes. The reason for her ire was trivial: a slight misplacement of a tea tray, an imagined neglect. But to the young gentlewoman, the act carried the weight of centuries of judgment and expectation. In a motion swift and shocking, the stepmother's hand struck Eleanor across the wrist, a gesture so startling that the delicate laughter of nearby guests faltered into silence. The sting of the blow was compounded by the electric shame that rippled through Eleanor's senses, and for a fleeting moment, the garden seemed to contract, every bloom and fountain suspended in witness to the violation. Before the moment could deepen into a spectacle of scandal, a presence intervened with an authority that silenced the petty cruelty in an instant. The Duke of Wexford, recently returned from parliamentary duties in London, whose reputation for strict moral rectitude preceded him, had observed the scene. Known to his peers as a man of duty and precise judgment, he stepped forward with measured calm, his early 30s lending an air of gravitas tempered by quiet restraint. His hand closed gently yet firmly around Eleanor's wrist, intercepting any further indignity. The deliberate intimacy of the gesture, restrained yet profoundly personal, defied the rigid expectations of propriety. He leaned closer, his voice low and steady, carrying words meant only for her ears. No woman beneath my roof, or within my sight, shall suffer cruelty unchallenged. The sound of his whisper, composed yet laced with authority, reverberated through Eleanor's consciousness, planting the first seeds of trust, fear, and unbidden longing. Guests, still frozen in mild shock, soon resumed their polite perambulations, murmuring behind fans and parasols, while Eleanor stood, her heart both fluttering and stilled by the Duke's intervention. The stepmother, cheeks flushed with both embarrassment and simmering rage, withdrew with a posture that attempted dignity but betrayed none. Arabella, ever aware of social optics, fluttered to Eleanor's side, offering a hand touched lightly upon her sister's arm. Yet her eyes held a mixture of curiosity, disbelief, and the faintest twinge of envy. Eleanor, for her part, felt the complex interplay of humiliation and protection coil tightly within her chest, each emotion a silent promise that the world she had so carefully navigated was shifting under unseen hands. The garden, once merely a stage for polite amusement, became a crucible for subtle transformations. Eleanor's observation of the Duke, precise and unflinching, revealed a man who measured both action and intention, a figure whose public decorum could not conceal the steadiness and moral conviction underlying his every movement. She recognized in him a parallel to her own restrained nature, yet magnified by the weight of responsibility and expectation. For a brief moment, their eyes met in acknowledgment of mutual awareness, a connection that society might deem improper, but that each understood as a recognition of inherent worth. As the sun descended behind the western copse, casting long shadows that stretched across fountains and garden statuary, Eleanor allowed herself a careful breath. The humiliation of the moment remained, as did the sting of the stepmother's hand, yet it had been transmuted, in some measure, by the Duke's intervention into a complex tapestry of possibility. Society, ever watchful, would remember the incident, but so too would she. Within that fleeting interstice of action and gaze, Eleanor glimpsed a future neither planned nor wholly controlled by her family's ambitions. A life in which her character, intellect, and quiet courage might find recognition, even within the rigid hierarchies of Regency England. The garden party drew to a close, guests departing in carriages drawn by horses whose flanks gleamed in the last light of day, their conversation now tinged with the subtle scandal of witness protection and unspoken promise. Arabella, maintaining her composure with polished efficiency, continued to smile and bow as if nothing untoward had transpired, yet Eleanor felt the invisible recalibration of familial expectations and social perception settling around her. She walked beside her stepmother and sister with measured poise, though her thoughts were far away, returning again and again to the moment when her wrist had been caught, and to the whisper that had promised safety and, perhaps, something more precarious: attention, respect, and the recognition of her own unseen worth. In that twilight, the estate itself seemed to breathe with anticipation, the ancient oaks rustling in quiet conspiracy, the fountains murmuring in delicate cadence, and the flowers bowing in gentle acquiescence to the winds of change. Eleanor Marchmont, once relegated to the shadows of her sister's brilliance, felt the first stirrings of agency and quiet courage, poised to navigate the treacherous waters of inheritance, duty, and desire. The Duke, for his part, observed with measured thoughtfulness, recognizing in the young gentlewoman a steadiness and sincerity that promised a partnership far more enduring than the transient display of social polish. And so, amid the fading gold of a Regency summer evening, the stage was set, scandal and propriety entwined, eyes upon them all, for a story of duty, honor, and the quietly powerful emergence of love that would challenge expectation and define futures yet unseen. The days following the garden party unfolded in a manner both ordinary and extraordinary, for society's gaze is both relentless and selective, often magnifying the smallest indiscretions while leaving the more significant truths unobserved. Eleanor found herself at the heart of a delicate tension, a web woven from whispers, polite inquiries, and the quiet, persistent attention of the Duke of Wexford. Though her stepmother sought to reassert authority through clipped remarks and pointed gestures, the Duke's intervention lingered like a shadow upon the room, his measured presence turning each glance, each acknowledgement, into a subtle declaration of interest and propriety. Eleanor, attuned to the unspoken rules that governed drawing rooms and dinner tables alike, understood that her world had shifted, though the precise shape of the shift remained unclear. She moved through her days with careful composure, reading by the window as the late summer sun cast a honeyed glow across her father's study. Yet each encounter with the Duke, whether a fleeting glance or a formally offered courtesy, drew her attention as if a chord had been struck in the otherwise muted symphony of her life. Arabella, meanwhile, navigated the household and society with an elegance that masked both ambition and subtle disappointment. She had expected to be the sole recipient of the Duke's attention, to be chosen as a jewel upon the Marchmont family crown, and the reality of Eleanor's emergence into prominence stirred a mixture of curiosity, jealousy, and self-reproach. In her interactions with guests, Arabella continued to perform with flawless poise, her laughter sparkling like the crystal decanters at tea, yet the keen observer would notice the brief flickers of unease in her eyes whenever her younger sister and the Duke were within speaking distance. The household buzzed with discreet speculation, servants and acquaintances alike weaving narratives from the smallest gestures, a reserved bow, a quietly offered chair, the barely perceptible warmth of a shared conversation. Letters became the medium through which the Duke and Eleanor explored the contours of a relationship, both proper and perilously intimate. Wax seals, pressed with careful precision, delivered words crafted in the measured cadence of Regency etiquette, yet laden with nuanced meaning. He inquired after her health, her thoughts on literature, her observations of estate management, and the conduct of household affairs, subjects that allowed them to communicate not merely as observer and observed, but as minds in quiet dialogue. Eleanor, in her responses, mirrored the careful tone of his missives, revealing a perceptive intelligence and moral clarity that transcended the expectations of a society obsessed with ornament and appearance. Each letter, exchanged under the scrutiny of propriety, became a token of regard more potent than any jewel or lace-trimmed gift, and within their carefully curated words lay the tender stirrings of understanding and trust. The stepmother, ever vigilant, interpreted these correspondences with a mixture of suspicion and indignation. To her, the letters were potential instruments of impropriety, hints of a boldness in Eleanor that might upend carefully laid plans. She spoke of decorum in clipped tones, reminding both daughters and servants of the boundaries of propriety, yet the very insistence on restraint served only to highlight Eleanor's quiet ascendancy. The father, torn between the need to preserve familial honor and the desire to secure a financially advantageous match for Arabella, observed with a measured anxiety, sensing the subtle shift in attention without fully grasping its implications. In this intricate dance, each movement, each measured word, each courteous gesture became an expression of power, negotiation, and the slow unraveling of expectation. Tokens of regard, though small and restrained, carried a weight that society could neither quantify nor wholly comprehend. The Duke, in his subtlety, chose gifts that reflected Eleanor's intellect and character rather than mere beauty or ornamentation. A rare volume of poetry, bound in leather and carefully inscribed, arrived at the Marchmont estate, its contents selected with meticulous thought, each poem a mirror to themes of courage, morality, and quiet virtue. On another occasion, a single blossom, picked in secret from the Duke's estate garden, was placed upon Eleanor's writing desk with a note that spoke not of superficial admiration, but of recognition and attention to her singular qualities. To the casual observer, these gestures might appear insignificant, yet within the delicate lattice of social expectation, they were potent symbols, signaling a preference that challenged conventional norms and hinted at a deeper understanding between giver and recipient. Society, as it often does, seized upon these minute deviations from expectation with an eagerness that bordered on obsession. Whispered conjectures circulated among guests and acquaintances. Why did the Duke seek Eleanor's counsel when Arabella was the celebrated beauty? Why did he linger in her presence, albeit briefly, when the drawing rooms were crowded with those deemed more suitable? The subtle scandal of attention without impropriety became a source of fascination, each gesture analyzed and interpreted with the rigor of a tribunal. Eleanor, acutely aware of the consequences of observation, navigated these moments with grace, her composure a shield against both public scrutiny and private anxiety. In her interior world, she balanced a careful gratitude for the Duke's respect with the burgeoning awareness of feelings she had not anticipated, a quiet hope tempered by an understanding of the societal constraints that governed their interaction. Arabella's growing disquiet manifested in ways both visible and concealed. She continued to perform her role with precision, yet the slightest tightening of a smile, the brief hesitation before engaging in conversation, betrayed the unrest stirring beneath her carefully composed exterior. The stepmother, too, sensed the shift, responding with admonitions and subtle critiques, attempting to reclaim the narrative and reassert the primacy of Arabella's projected desirability. Yet despite these efforts, the attention of the Duke remained measured and deliberate, focused not on superficial ornament, but upon qualities that spoke to stability, intellect, and moral rectitude. Each encounter, whether mediated through letters, formal calls, or the careful choreography of a dance, reinforced the subtle reordering of social priorities, a quiet upheaval that the Marchmont household could scarcely acknowledge without discomfort. Amid these shifting currents, Eleanor's understanding of her own agency deepened. She recognized that her worth was not solely contingent upon beauty or societal approval, and that the Duke's regard, tempered by propriety and guided by discernment, offered a rare form of acknowledgement, a recognition of character that transcended the superficial measures of feminine accomplishment. She observed him with an attention that was both analytical and quietly emotional, noting the deliberate care in his speech, the precise yet gentle manner in which he addressed her, and the unspoken standards of honor that governed his conduct. In these observations, she found both reassurance and a challenge. To rise to the level of expectation implied by his respect, to navigate the intricate lattice of social scrutiny while preserving dignity and composure. As autumn deepened, the estate became a stage upon which these subtleties played out. Guests arrived for evening assemblies, the long shadows of candlelight stretching across parquet floors, reflecting a world where the slightest misstep could reverberate through reputation and social standing. Eleanor moved through these gatherings with measured grace, the Duke's presence a quiet anchor amid the swirl of conversation, music, and observation. Their interactions remained within the bounds of propriety, yet each gesture, each word, carried layered significance, a shared insight, a carefully phrased inquiry, a note of approval discreetly offered. Society, attuned to pattern and deviation alike, interpreted these small actions as portents, and the slow accumulation of attention, respect, and mutual recognition laid the groundwork for both scandal and romance. The culminating point of this subtle escalation arrived in the form of an invitation. A private walk through the wooded avenues of the estate, sanctioned under the guise of examining the condition of the grounds after a late summer storm. The Duke, ever mindful of propriety, maintained a measured distance, yet the intimacy of shared observation, the exchange of ideas about estate management, literature, and moral responsibility created a space in which Eleanor could encounter the depth of his character unmediated by public performance. They walked in silence as often as in conversation, the rustle of leaves underfoot and the soft murmur of distant fountains accompanying words carefully chosen, each laden with meaning. The tension of expectation, propriety, and social observation made every pause pregnant with possibility, and every glance weighted with unspoken acknowledgement. By the close of these days, Eleanor found herself transformed, not in outward appearance, which remained modest and proper, but in perception and self-awareness. She recognized that her intellect, moral fortitude, and quiet courage had drawn the attention of a man whose position, lineage, and character rendered his regard both exceptional and perilous in its implications. The Duke, for his part, saw in her a partner of thought and principle, someone whose steadiness could anchor his own responsibilities and whose character promised companionship beyond the superficial allure of society's expectations. The household, the estate, and the broader network of social observers continued to speculate. Yet within Eleanor and the Duke lay a foundation of understanding, respect, and restrained affection, a beginning both scandalous in its subtlety and profound in its promise. As twilight descended once more, the Marchmont estate seemed to exhale, the flickering candlelight reflecting against the windows, the gardens bathed in the soft hues of evening, and the air carrying the lingering scent of rain and foliage. Eleanor, seated at her writing desk, pressed pen to paper with a care that mirrored the Duke's own deliberation, crafting words that balanced sincerity and discretion, intellect and emotion. Each letter, each token of attention, each measured glance in the drawing room wove a tapestry of anticipation, a slow-burning promise that society could neither dictate nor fully comprehend. And so, in the quiet interstice between expectation and desire, scandal and propriety, Eleanor and the Duke moved ever closer along a path defined not by the caprice of fashion or fortune, but by the steadfast recognition of character, intellect, and moral courage. The first frost of winter had settled upon Thornfield Manor, transforming the gardens into a crystalline tableau, the fountains frozen in delicate arcs and the hedges dusted with shimmering white. Within the warmth of the house, firelight danced across the polished floors and gilded frames, painting the familiar spaces with a new intimacy. Eleanor sat by the library window, a candle flickering beside her, the gentle illumination reflecting the careful lines of her writing as she composed another letter to the Duke of Wexford. The correspondence had become a lifeline between them, each exchange a measured revelation of thought, principle, and restrained feeling. She wrote not as a woman seeking fortune or favor, but as one engaged in the quiet work of understanding another mind, discerning virtue, and testing the boundaries of propriety with subtle deliberation. The words flowed with care, each sentence balanced between honesty and decorum, the act itself a reflection of the moral and emotional fortitude that had begun to define her. The Duke arrived later that evening, his carriage crunching over the frost-kissed gravel, his presence announced by the quiet authority of the footmen and the rustle of his long coat. Eleanor rose, her composure intact, though her heart betrayed a fluttering anticipation she dared not reveal. He entered the room with the same measured dignity she had come to recognize, tall, impeccably dressed, and carrying an air of disciplined command tempered by attentiveness. His gaze met hers, not with the superficial appraisal of society, but with an acknowledgement that spoke of understanding, respect, and the careful attention of one who had long observed character rather than display. In that look, Eleanor sensed both protection and challenge, an invitation to meet his steadiness with her own courage, to step beyond the world of observation into one of shared purpose. They spoke first of the practicalities that occupied the Duke's mind, the condition of the estate, the management of tenantry, and the precise calculations of harvests and rents. In these discussions, Eleanor found herself valued not merely for politeness or charm, but for insight, reasoning, and foresight. Her observations, once confined to the quiet solitude of study and reflection, were now recognized as substantive contributions, shaping decisions that would affect lives and the stewardship of property for years to come. The Duke listened with deliberation, responding with a mixture of approval and gentle correction, a dynamic that fostered a sense of equality within the bounds of social expectation. Even in the exchange of practical counsel, an intimacy grew, subtle and unspoken, a recognition of intellect and character that neither required nor sought the embellishments of conventional romance. As the evening progressed, conversation turned toward literature, philosophy, and the arts, the subjects Eleanor had long cherished in private, now shared openly with one who appreciated depth over display. The Duke, careful to maintain propriety, allowed space for her opinions to emerge, valuing the reasoned argument, the quiet wit, and the moral clarity she brought to each topic. In turn, Eleanor observed him closely, noting the precision of his speech, the integrity of his judgments, and the steadfastness that underlay his reputation. She discerned that his interest in her was not frivolous nor transient. It was founded upon recognition of the virtues that society often overlooked and upon a desire for partnership rather than mere ornament. In this awareness, her respect deepened, and with it a delicate, burgeoning affection tempered by prudence yet undeniable in its intensity. The household, however, could not remain unaware of these subtle shifts, for society thrives upon scrutiny and whispers. Arabella, whose beauty and social training had long promised favor, watched with a mounting mixture of curiosity, resentment, and silent dismay. Her smiles retained the polish demanded by etiquette, yet the fleeting glances she cast toward Eleanor betrayed her awareness of a change that was quietly revolutionary. The stepmother, equally vigilant, sought to reassert control through subtle criticisms and pointed remarks, aiming to redirect attention toward the elder daughter and away from the rising prominence of the younger. The father, torn between affection, duty, and concern for family reputation, observed the interactions with anxious calculation, aware that propriety and social expectation might conflict with the more profound truths unfolding before him. Amid these currents, a decisive moment arrived when the Duke extended an invitation to examine the estate grounds following a particularly harsh frost, presenting it as a practical matter of stewardship. Eleanor, understanding the propriety of the arrangement and the necessity of careful navigation, accepted with measured grace. Together they traversed the glistening avenues, the frost crunching underfoot, and the bare branches of winter trees etching intricate patterns against a slate-gray sky. Their conversation, while grounded in the care of land and people, allowed for the emergence of a more personal dialogue. Reflections on duty, the burdens of lineage, and the moral obligations that guided their respective lives. Each statement was weighted with meaning, each response deliberate, as they probed the depths of mutual understanding without transgressing the boundaries of decorum. It was here, amid the quiet austerity of the winter landscape, that the first full acknowledgment of their shared regard occurred. The Duke, his voice low and precise, expressed admiration for Eleanor's judgment, her steadiness, and her capacity to navigate both the moral and practical demands of life with integrity. "Miss Marchmont," he said, pausing to meet her gaze with a gravity that silenced the world around them, "I have observed many in my years, yet few possess the clarity and courage you display. It is not beauty that I seek to honor, but the strength of character which will endure long after the gilded ornaments of society have faded." Eleanor, her composure tested by the gravity of his words, responded with measured sincerity, acknowledging the weight of expectation, the prudence required, and the quiet hope that perhaps recognition and affection might coexist within the bounds of propriety. The path back to the house was marked by silence. It was a silence imbued with understanding rather than absence. Each step, each gesture, was laden with the acknowledgement of mutual respect and the possibility of a future shaped by shared values rather than social convenience. The household, upon their return, observed the interactions with subtle curiosity, yet the nature of the relationship remained discreet, shielded by the meticulous observance of etiquette and the deliberate cultivation of propriety. In the drawing rooms and hallways, whispers persisted, but the content of those whispers could scarcely reach the depth of connection forged in the measured steps of a winter walk or the quiet intimacy of correspondence. In the weeks that followed, the Duke's regard became increasingly evident through acts both formal and nuanced. A seat offered at the dinner table, carefully placed letters of appreciation, the presentation of books chosen with thoughtful consideration. All these tokens reinforced a bond rooted in recognition of intellect, moral fortitude, and emotional steadiness. Eleanor, in turn, responded with grace, her actions and words reflecting both acknowledgement and the cautious cultivation of trust. Each exchange, whether observed by society or kept private, advanced the intimacy between them while preserving the rigorous standards of decorum that governed their world. It was a partnership forged not in ostentation, but in deliberate attention to character, a quiet rebellion against the superficiality of expectation. Arabella's frustration, though contained within the limits of polite society, reached its subtle crescendo during an evening assembly when the disparity between public admiration and private regard became apparent. The elder daughter's carefully curated poise could not mask the growing recognition of Eleanor's emerging significance, and even the stepmother's interventions proved insufficient to re-establish the previous hierarchy. Guests, attuned to nuance and skilled in observation, remarked upon the attentiveness and respect with which the Duke treated Eleanor, acknowledging what society could not fully articulate. That virtue, intelligence, and moral integrity commanded a form of admiration far surpassing the superficial allure of beauty or decorum alone. The culmination of this slow, deliberate ascent toward acknowledgement occurred in the intimate setting of the library, where the Duke, mindful of propriety yet emboldened by the consistency of Eleanor's character, spoke with an uncharacteristic candor. He conveyed his recognition of her fortitude, his desire for partnership, and the certainty that she embodied the qualities essential to the stewardship of estate, family, and lineage. Eleanor, her composure intact though her heart swelled with emotion, accepted the gravity of his words, understanding the depth of commitment implied by a union founded upon respect, intellect, and shared moral vision. In that moment, the household's expectations, the whisperings of society, and the weight of conventional ambition were subordinated to the quiet, enduring force of character and discernment. As the evening drew to a close, the Marchmont estate seemed to exhale in the stillness of winter, the frost glinting faintly in the moonlight, and the firelight casting a final glow upon polished floors and well-loved furniture. Eleanor, seated once more at her writing desk, reflected upon the journey from invisibility to recognition, from quiet observation to the acknowledgement of her worth. The Duke, watching from across the room, understood that the foundation they had built, through letters, careful gestures, and measured attention, promised a partnership of enduring strength, one capable of withstanding societal scrutiny and the pressures of inheritance alike. In the union of mind, principle, and restrained affection, the slow burn of understanding had matured into a bond that neither scandal nor expectation could diminish. The household, the estate, and the social world beyond remained poised on the cusp of observation. Yet within Eleanor and the Duke lay a quiet certainty. That love, grounded in character and tempered by propriety, could flourish even amid the strictures of Regency England.